A warm welcome to you all on this online launch of Breaking Out of the Justice Loop, a seminal new report that calls for a transformative approach to women's justice. By way of an introduction, I'm Abbi Ayers, the Director of Strategic Development for the National Women's Justice Coalition, and I'll be acting as chair for today's event. And I'm delighted to welcome to our panel the report's co-authors, Naomi Delap, Director of the charity Birth Companions, and Liz Hogarth OBE, an independent women's justice expert and former civil servant. We're also very pleased to be joined today by Helen Mills, Head of Programmes at the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. We're going to start today's event with some scene setting from Liz, looking back at the checkered history of women's justice reforms and learnings from the previous work that's gone before and that has significantly informed this report. Naomi will then give us an overview of the report itself, summarising central themes and arguments and providing some context to the report's recommendations. Before Helen will lead discussions about the challenges and obstacles we need to collectively overcome in order to drive the meaningful change we want to see. We'll then reflect on what needs to be done to overcome the barriers and adopt the solutions-based thinking and recommendations made out in this report to progress to next steps. As our audience, we encourage you to write any questions that you may have in the chat, and I can put these to our panel. And we'll also invite you to participate in interactive polls that we'll be hosting at different points throughout this session. And we'll then share the poll results at intervals to gauge the collective opinions of the group. So your input and ideas today are really crucial to furthering these discussions. And we're delighted that so many of you committed your time today to being part of today's event. So Liz, I'm going to hand over to you to tell us a little bit about where we come from so far.
Thanks very much, Abbi. This is not going to be a long history of the last 20 years. I just want to pick out a few instances where we learned lessons and need to learn lessons, kicking off with what went well from my perspective. Three key things for me. The first one was about overriding resistance from senior civil servants by having an emphatic political will. What we had when we kicked off before Causton, we had some work in the women's policy team trying to do joined up across government. We had a programme board of officials and nothing ever happened. When the Causton report came in, Patricia Scotland was adamant that wasn't going to be the case. So from the get-go, we had a cross-departmental interministerial group that had accountability, therefore, to Parliament regularly, reporting on progress. So it was transparent up front. It had a national framework with measurable deliverables and time-bounded over 3 years. And probably most effective of all, we had a ministerial champion. Ministerial champions can do different things. They can be warm and welcoming. Ours, Maria Eagle, was great at bringing in the senior civil servants who are very good at defining the barriers but not the solutions, and helping them sign up and get things done made a huge difference. So that was the first lesson. The other two key things for me, which were huge and radical and still feel radical, ironically, and that was getting dedicated ring-fence funding that enabled us to establish very, very quickly a network of about 40 women's centres and other specialist services. Now, some of those had been operating for 30 odd years in the community, helping women, basically health and well-being, and were now opening up to just impacted women. Others were starting from scratch. So it was about building infrastructure, getting them going, and ring-fence funding helped nurture them, knowing it wasn't suddenly going to be pulled and things disappearing. That was very important. The third key lesson for me, which I didn't realise at the time was so big, was the policy shift to open collaboration with the women's sector and women with lived experience. This was way before this became the important issue it now is. Jean Causton was adamant she wanted to get to the heart of what the problems were, And she was adamant that on her reference group, as well as various ministers and some voluntary agencies, she had women's centres and she had women in prison. So we had Calderdale Women's Centre, Together Women's Centre, enabling her to meet with women, some in the community, some in prison, women in prison arranging interviews for her. And that deeply affected her. And for me, is what enabled her to say, women, those with lived experience and those women working alongside them in buying for women centres needed to be at the heart of the Corston reforms. So they were the positive lessons learned. We learned lessons of what didn't work so well and probably what not to do. First of those sounds minor, policy shift from the Home Office to the Ministry of Justice in around 2009. Who knew? In the Home Office, we were next door to the Violence Against Women team, worked very closely with them, and were really getting traction on the fact that survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, whether they're impacted by offending or not, needed full attention. Women offenders weren't a separate group. It was also the front end work, women at risk, we could do better. The policing are in the Home Office. You can talk to them about how to stop women going beyond first point of contact with the police. All that was lost as we moved to the Ministry of Justice, which naturally in their silo world, they're about women entrenched in the justice system. So almost at a stroke, women at risk wobbled and left the scene. Then moving on to, and I don't want to be too depressing here, from 2010 to 2017, in a nutshell, I see these as the wilderness years. 2013, ring-fence funding for women's centres was lost. It was devolved to probation, who were told they could decide what to do with the money, and they did. So we lost the iconic Asher Centre down in Worcester. We lost the Swan Project up in the northeast, one of the few projects who were looking at how to take services to women in rural areas so they didn't face inequality, which they often did because not being enough of them in any setting. So pretty despondent stuff at that point. We also had unabated use of short sentences, which has continued with great alacrity. We had, I hesitate to say it, the debacle of transforming rehabilitation and payment by results, which decimated probation and threatened to decimate women's centres. We had academics, Lorraine Gelsthorpe, Carol Hedman, pointing out payment by results could not work for the women's centres model, and boy, it didn't. So very depressing, but lessons to be learned from that. We also had, moving on to 2018 to now, slightly more hope. We had David Gauke fleetingly, and one problem from the Ministry of Justice in this period, the revolving ministers, so very little traction of ministers being able to get in there and get things done. David Gauke with the female offender strategy, that was good news, but it had problems. It didn't have teeth. And the Concordat, the cross-departmental Concordat, that was fairly limp as well, so fairly ineffective. We also had the continuing, poor old probation, the continuing loss of the use of community orders, which makes it much more difficult for the women's sector to operate it effectively with justice involve women in the community. And the continued defunding of public services. So it has been pretty grim. The female offender strategy didn't have a delivery plan until 2022, so very late in the day. So all grim, but I would give a shout out to those officials working in women's policy who I know had to work so hard to get at least some funding of women's centres to keep them going. And that was so much appreciated. And I know they worked well with some of the Corston funders on getting the information and evidence they needed to get that funding through, which was great. But I want to finish off on a positive. The major learning I think we have from here is that women's centres, women's specialist services have actually survived all those dire years. They have the most amazing resilience. They have huge expertise, more than any of us locked in the criminal justice system. That expertise of what women need in a local setting and how agencies can work together. So, and I give a caveat here, they're also exhausted. It has been unremitting for them. But if we do want systems change now, we have ready and waiting that core element that has to be at the heart of that change. And I'll stop there, Abbi.
Liz, thank you. That's incredibly helpful and providing great context to the conversations and discussions we're going to go on to now have. We'd like to invite you to participate in our first poll. So as our audience, please do take a vote in terms of answering this question. What would be the single most important reform the government could undertake for women's justice? So you've got 5 minutes to vote. We'd encourage you to do so before we publish the results. Meanwhile, we're going to discuss things amongst ourselves. So Liz, picking up on some of the points you made in your discussion, really one of the key lessons here is that senior political commitment is critical. And without it, do you believe reform is really doomed to wither?
I absolutely do, I'm afraid. And I suppose this is because I still think back to the times when I first went to do women's policy, then in the Home Office. I had come from working in Holloway, you know, full of ideas, full of passion that we couldn't go on like we were. And I thought people would be willing to do so. Without it, and in addition to the things I've said, if I just give you a little anecdote, we first got money for women way before Corston with the Together Women programme money. Treasury gave us £9 million and said, can you do something? And we were testing out the concept of the use of women's centres. £9 million, my little team were overjoyed. We were busy scribbling away how it's going to be spent, what we would do, get things going. Couldn't get hold of the money. We were told over a 6-month period by the National Offender Management Service finance lead that we weren't going to get the money because NOMs didn't want to do things for women. I couldn't believe it, and it was actually rectified. I bumped into Paul Goggins in the street outside Marsham Street, and he said, what on earth's happening? And I wasn't a very good civil servant because I'd be open and upfront. So he asked me, so I told him. And I said, we can't get the money. He went straight to the head of NOMs, and we had the money by that afternoon. So for me, that's a slam dunk. You know, if you haven't got politicians there saying, we want to make this happen, and we will, officials won't follow on afterwards. So it's absolutely essential.
Yeah, no, we hear that point. And you know, thinking about the impact of Corston, do you feel we're in a position now where if we just do what Corston proposed, we would find the solutions? Or do you feel the world has now moved on and we need to come up with some alternative approaches?
I'd love to say the world has moved on, and of course it has in some ways, and there are different things we can look at doing, working alongside women that could make life better for them. But if I look at it, as I say, when I worked in Holloway, we all said things are terrible for women, they've got to improve. We had women being taken in cuffs to hospital to give birth. What have we got today? Same. It's still happening. We had appalling self-harm. What have we got today? It is absolutely off the Richter scale. So women's prisons today are much more unsafe for women than when I worked in them and said, this is bad, we've got to do something. You know, so the Corston report in many ways has stayed seminal, and I think is the only way we will get change, as long as we look at stemming the flow of those women into the criminal justice system, that unnecessary sucking in that goes on. because once you're in there, well, we're saying it with the justice loop and breaking out, it is so hard to get out of it and get your life back and build your life again. So for me, Corsten is pretty much there. There will be odd things around the edges, but I don't see any other. I haven't heard in 20 years anyone come up with a better plan.
Thanks, Liz. And thanks as well to Grace, who notes that the world has moved on, but the criminal justice system is decades behind. So fair point. Right, let's see the result of the poll. If we could now publish that. Interesting to see what you all think. Right, so really the overriding majority there feel that reform to sentencing is needed to significantly reduce reform. And I think that's the point we're going to talk about more as we progress through today. So I'm going to hand over now to Naomi to talk a bit more about the Breaking Out the Justice Loop report and provide a bit of context to how that report has been developed.
Thanks, Abby. Well, we've heard from Liz, haven't we, about the impact of the failings of the system and actually how that has deteriorated significantly over the last 20 years. It's harming women and their families. The human and financial cost is vast and we need comprehensive solutions. So Liz and I looked, as she's just outlined, at what we can learn from what's happened over the last 20 years in terms of implementation of Corsten, but we also looked at other models and systems. And we found some really interesting stuff out there. So our report makes recommendations in 4 main areas to ensure that our ambition, our collective ambition for transformational change to this system is realised. The first area we looked at was the structure of the Women's Justice Board and what it does. And we found that we felt that the Women's Justice Board should be more clearly modelled on the Youth Justice Board with a ring-fenced budget and independence from direct ministerial control. Now, we are obviously assuming that those involved in the Women's Justice work at the moment are looking very closely at what the Youth Justice Board has achieved over the last 20 years. They've reduced the numbers of children in custody so significantly, falling from, I think, around 3,000 in the early noughties to fewer than 350 in 2024. And that cohort is similar in number to numbers of women in prison. So there's a scale similarity there. We liked the YJB's approach, prioritising early intervention, the plank of Corsten's model that has been lost, multi-agency collaboration, community-based solutions, diversion from custody. And we looked a little bit about how that approach worked in terms of financing, although there's not a huge amount of evidence out there, specific evidence, but assuming that the approach needs front loading, that it needs investment up front, but it leads to considerable savings in the longer term from that saving on imprisoning children. We felt that its status was important, appointed by independent of government with strict accountability mechanisms. Obviously, we do need to acknowledge, the sort of the bonfire of the quangos that's been happening recently, and that's been a shift even in the last kind of couple of weeks. So the YJB is a quango. But the nature of independence, we should still explore further and how that can be achieved through whichever means is politically expedient. And we can also learn from where the YJB has experienced challenges. It hasn't been all success. We know that the children who are still held in custody experience, terrible conditions at times. And we know that there are still very significant racial and socioeconomic disparities, which they haven't managed to overcome. So the second area that we were interested in is sentencing, and obviously we thought that sentencing should reflect the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women, with a presumption against imprisonment and a central role for effective probation practice, which all sounds pretty obvious, really. sentencing will be a key tool through which to reduce the numbers of women imprisoned. So the independent review is really well timed, and we're all looking with anticipation at what will emerge from that. Clearly the numbers of short-term sentences are ridiculous and need to come down, and at the same time we need to increase community sentences. We also need to make far better use of deferred and suspended sentences. We need to focus on recall and remand. The problem around remand is huge. It's not within the scope of the sentencing review, but it's such an important issue that we expect that it will be very high on the agenda of the Women's Justice Board in the near future. And there's a central role for a revitalised probation service in making sentencing reform a success. And I think we would all agree that probation officers need to be trained in and committed to addressing the specific needs of women and doing that in a relational way, because that's what we know works. So our third area of inquiry was women's centres and specialist organisations. And as Liz has just very convincingly argued, they should be at the heart of a holistic, women-centred and integrated approach with sustainable funding underpinning this work. Look, it's a proven model. We know that the evidence shows that women's centres can reduce reoffending amongst many other positive metrics. We know that it's cheaper. We haven't got completely up-to-date figures, but we did a little calculation on some slightly old figures, and we reckon that the cost per woman per year in a women's centres, maybe the highest cost is around £5,000 a year. Now that compares very favourably with £37,000 for the cheapest women's prison place and £93,000 for the most expensive. And as Liz has already referred to, despite the underfunding of women's centres and specialist services, coupled with extreme financial precarity, they do continue to do fantastic work, including playing a central role in prevention. So just think what they could achieve with the right support. So our fourth and final area of inquiry was the public health approach. We felt that we should be looking very carefully at this model, which emphasises prevention over punishment. And this should be implemented in order to address the root causes of women's criminalisation. Liz and I were looking for an overarching framework of change, something that could support a systemic shift towards this prevention and early intervention agenda in order to effect this radical transformation we're all seeking. And we found inspiration in the public health approach adopted by initiatives such as the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. This has been enormously successful in reducing homicides. They, I believe, halved in Scotland over 19 years. Glasgow used to be known as the murder capital of Europe, and I don't think it is anymore. Now, of course, the public health approach, this is metaphorical. It's a way of tackling complex societal problems such as violence or criminalisation, as if we were aiming to prevent the spread of a disease. In the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, this work is organised in 3 levels of intervention. So you have primary, which is tackling the conditions which allow, in this case, violence to develop. Secondary, which is early intervention to stop things getting worse. And then tertiary, which is responding to the violence once it's happened and treating the effects and rehabilitating the people and the areas affected. So actually you've got 2 areas which are very firmly about stopping it getting to the third area. So we envisage this public health approach providing the framework and the vision needed for the reforms that we're also desperately seeking.
Naomi, thank you. That's a really helpful overview. I'd like to just bring in some of the comments that have been posted in the chat that are really speaking to the points that you're making. Deborah from Inquest points out that we need to dismantle women's presence and really invest in gender-informed alternatives. Absolutely, Deborah. And Mark Blake draws attention to the very recent and public dispute between the Justice Secretary and the Sentencing Council, referring to the two-tier justice system. Yeah, absolutely, Mark. You know, that disconnect, and that is a worrying sign. So the role of the Justice Secretary has to be viewed as having an immense value and status within the spending departments. Malcolm points out, yeah, again, very much an important point. And Laura, thank you for saying that the political will change if public perceptions change. And we need to humanise women's stories and experiences and destigmatise women's involvement with the criminal justice system. So Laura, thank you. Naomi, just what you were talking about the Youth Justice Board was really interesting there. And, you know, talking about the independence that board has and the success that board has achieved. But do you feel that there's a risk that ministers may more easily ignore an independent Women's Justice Board that would be modelled more closely to the quango that is the YJB?
I mean, I think that ministers have shown that they are invested in this area. You know, they've moved fast, and they've moved pretty effectively actually to start work in this area. I mean, I think what Liz was talking about, what she was reflecting on, is what happens a few years down the line. So I think that that's really key. You know, start off with good intentions, but then don't let it slip further on down the line.
Yeah.
So once this strategy has been set, I think the important factor is probably having the resource to carry out that work. It's not clear at the moment with the Women's Justice Board, a board of appointed volunteers, with the Partnership Delivery Group, which is the sort of implementation group, also unpaid, albeit expert and independent. So those are all really important people to be involved. But what's the resource going to be, both in terms of the man and woman power needed to implement these reforms, and then the investment in what those reforms are. So I think what is established over the next couple of years will tell us whether those reforms are going to last or not. And you know, speaking to Liz's point about cross-ministerial involvement and investment, that's going to be really, really significant in keeping things on track as well. If it's not a quango, then there has to be, I think, something else that enables that this work to continue effectively.
And the role of the women's sector in this is key, and recognising the value and contribution that the Women's Centre Network can provide is really important. So how can we make sure that that network of specialists is at the heart of the Justice Board's work, given the current composition of the board and the direction of travel that we're now headed?
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense that you know, representation on the board itself from the women's sector, from women's centres and specialist services is important, and I think should be added. I think there needs to be a stronger component of lived experience representation woven throughout all of this work, because it's not going to be possible to do this work effectively without placing those women right at the centre of all of this work, and giving power and a seat at the table. I think also, you know, I would really welcome a specific commitment to having women's centres, you know, in every community. I think that could be a really good building of the work that Coulston did.
Yeah, absolutely. Naomi, thank you. We remind you, do post your questions in the chat. We'd really like to take those and put those to our panel. But again, we want your engagement here on our next poll. We're going to initiate that now. What is the single biggest barrier to creating a criminal justice system that works for women? So those 4 options there, please do take a vote. We've got 5 minutes for this, so do cast your vote to inform our discussions. The single biggest barrier to creating a criminal justice system that works for women. So I'm going to hand over now to Helen, who's going to talk a bit about the barriers that we do need to overcome to progress change.
Thank you. Good luck on your voting. You have 4 interesting choices to make there, as to which you pick as your biggest. I'm going to pick out 3 this morning to speak about. I hope they're helpful to the discussion that we want to have about how we move forward. So they're finance, a punitive political climate, and women as an afterthought. So on the first, on finance, we've heard already today about the lack of sustained government support for the full implementation of the Courseman recommendations. And I know from who's here that many people live with financial uncertainty in their own work and for those women that they support. That's why the Breaking the Justice Loop's call for sufficient ring-fenced resource over the long term is so important. But I think we all know the wider context is this. The government's fiscal rules means that a constrained environment across public spending is set to continue, which makes any calls for increased spending already tough. And we've added to this. There's the new possibility about prioritising defence spending. Cutting foreign aid was the opening gambit. It is unlikely to stop there. This week, in fact, even today, I think we're going to be hearing more about the new restrictions on welfare benefits. And then there is the Ministry of Justice. The Public Accounts Committee, in its report last week, painted a grim picture. Its report was on prison capacity, and it said, the justice system faces total gridlock in 2026. The chair of the committee didn't mince his words either. He said, as with our recent inquiry into court backlogs, we find a department grappling with the fallout of problems it should have predicted, whilst awaiting the judgment of an external review, he's talking there about court sentencing review, before taking any truly radical corrective action. Lives are being increasingly put at risk. This firefighting approach is not exclusive to prisons. Many aspects of the criminal justice system are creaking. I think that breaking out the justice loop makes several suggestions about where we might start to look. That women's justice requires a cross-departmental approach, that the Ministry of Justice has a vitally important contribution to make, but it cannot be the centre of gravity for a women's justice initiative. I am thrilled to see a report that says this requires investment. The report says we need to speculate in early intervention to accumulate savings in the longer term. That is the business case for this. The immediate challenge is this is an approach that is at odds with what the government is rather optimistically looking for, and that is approaches that save us money now. We know these are not the same thing. Breaking out the justice loop sets out, I think, a theory of change and what that might look like based on investment. What I would ask is, what is the government's theory of change for achieving its stated aim, which has been hard won by the women's sector, of reducing women's imprisonment without investment? Because looking ahead, if we want to achieve positive change for women's justice, we need a fundamental rethink of its funding regimes. Number 2, punitive political climate. The recent interim report from the Independent Sentencing Review ahead of its full spring report, which, as Naomi says, we're all eagerly anticipating, is helpful in advocating for evidence-based and balanced approach that shifts the focus from punitive measures to more rehabilitative and restorative strategies. On the other hand, as Mark Blake has already pointed out to us today, there is the current argument between the Lord Chancellor, Shabana Mahmood, and the Sentencing Council over its guidelines encouraging the use of pre-sentence reports. I take this as a sign of how twitchy the government is about any reform that could be deemed controversial. I find it myself hard to square the Lord Chancellor's criticism of the Sentencing Council's new guidelines, which were a response to well-established evidence about discriminatory outcomes, with the comments she made several months prior, setting out the importance of change for women's imprisonment. Doesn't bode well, does it, for take-up from the sentencing review? Does not bode well for the priority that breaking out the justice loop points out we need to give to racially minoritised women. So my question here is, what role, if any, could we play in helping to dial down the rhetoric on punishment and create better approaches. I think the women's sector is brilliant at many things, and one of those is building excellent relationships and strong advocates over the years. Are we feeling optimistic about lots of new MPs, for example? My third and final one is sexism and women as an afterthought. Last week at an event organised by Women in Prison, Vera Baird gave examples from shoes that don't come in small enough sizes to electronic monitoring bracelets designed on the basis of male body size, where women are treated as an afterthought. As Breaking Out the Justice Loop report notes, it is imperative that the Women's Justice Board co-designs its structure and strategy together with the women's sector and with women's lived experience, and that such involvement is ongoing. There is a potential clear disconnect here between the voice and expertise in the women's sector and meaningful implementation. What we've seen, Liz has already spoken to today, is even when the government develops supposedly women-specific plans and strategies, the commitment can appear skin deep at best. And it's been very hard to hold to account when strategies do not seem to translate into deeds. Are there ways that we could better hold the government account for inaction?
Helen, thank you. That's really interesting summary of these key obstacles. And if we look now at the vote, the poll result, I mean, it's a very kind of mixed result, actually. We've got fairly divided opinions around the key challenges, but I think, you know, Helen's spoken to some of these in detail here. And just moving to the chat, thinking about, sorry, I'm just going to close that so I can see. Brilliant. An important comment from Harriet about the need for statutory defences for women who offend in response to or as a consequence of the abuse that they themselves are subjected to, that they shouldn't be prosecuted in any circumstances. You know, again, a really important point to be made there. And some questions coming through. Do the panellists think that there is a danger that Women's Centre funding, there we go. There's a danger that Women's Centre's funding will be co-opted so that they actually, instead of becoming independent women's hubs, become delivery sites for probation or community sentences? Does anyone want to speak to that particular point? Liz?
I think there may be some risk, but I think the women's sector is so strong and so clear. I remember back in the day with transforming rehabilitation, where suddenly women's centres were asked to be what was called responsible officers and getting caught up in breaching women, which is probation's role. And they won in the end. It took a lot of energy, but I think that's why our thinking is much more about empowering probation again, giving them the respect they need as the ace profession they are, and trying to pivot away from that prison-centric thing. I mean, at the moment, all those new probation officers, poor things, they're doing high-risk stuff the whole time. It's all about public protection. Of course, that's important. It is much harder to deal with risk in the community than it is in prison, but they are not funded for that. And we need to be allowing them to form that core relationship with courts again. They were valued by courts. They could help sentencers make better decisions. But locally, it's women's centres that will enable probation to do the working with other partners in the community that they've had less chance to do as everyone's got defunded. And we know that will cost, and we know that's a worry and all the rest. But actually, if you look at the billions going through Mod all the time for the prison-centric approach, there are ways to deal with that and get money, not just for women's centres. So probation is vibrant. We see pockets of really ace practice. Looking at Manchester, the whole systems approach for years, because a probation lead there said, come on, we're going to do this right. It's worked well with the women's centres. So I could go on for ages, but I don't think that risk is too much as long as we revitalise probation.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And I think, you know, reflecting back on what Helen was talking about with regards to funding and finance, we really do need to shift to an investment in community-based solutions. I think comments coming through in the chat highlighting that is there support for smaller charities? Charlotte Gould from Fresh Start is pointing out the fact that there are a postcode lottery, in essence, of funding. And if we look at the wider picture, the national picture, maybe there is more resource, more funding in sort of metropolitan areas and less so for pockets of England. And sustainability is a key challenge. So do we consider legislative change to make some offences, sorry, I'm just reading the chat, to make some offences and/or women with particular characteristics non-imprisonable, so diverting women out of custody, and instead of having that presumption against short sentencing, cease putting women in prison for very short periods of time. Do you think that is a really critical point here, Naomi?
Well, in my day job, I focus on pregnant women and mothers of infants, and that's certainly the argument that the case that we're making for that particular group. It's a pregnancy and maternity is a protected characteristic. The risks around being pregnant in prison, being separated from your baby whilst in prison are really, really significant. So yes, we believe that for the vast majority of these women, we should stop sending them to prison, and that legislative change is needed to support that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to add to that and go back to, I think, a point that Harriet was making about women and the abuse they face, and how that ends up being criminalised. And I suppose one thing that I've been thinking about in terms of the constrained financial environment is that if that is the reality and we need to keep making the case for investment and an alternative, but that may be a longer journey than we would like, the more perhaps immediate thing to play for might be legislative change. One of the areas that I would advocate for that is our complicity laws, which I think are a total mess, and for lots of reasons, but one of them being that I think women are often being convicted and imprisoned on very long mandatory minimum sentences for violence because of their role as assisting and encouraging. And they have played very little role within the violence itself, but there is nothing within our sentencing framework that allows judges enough discretion to take those factors into account, and they are subject to the same mandatory minimums as if they dealt a fatal blow. That is, for me, one clear area that does not require funding, that I have not met a law practitioner yet of any persuasion will not tell me is a mess, that I think women have a real role to gain in.
Yeah, thank you.
Cost neutral.
Or cost saving, because I think those are those long sentences.
Yeah.
But I realise that kind of moves us actually a little bit away from the idea of short prison sentences and the cost saving there, and I appreciate that argument. I also think there are arguments around just the women who are locked up from violence and the length of sentences they face.
Thank you. I think an interesting comment from the chat from Liz Warner, that the poll options do interweave. And, if we think about the inherent challenges within the commissioning structures and procurement processes and how these penalise smaller specialist women's organisations, and the financial constraints that those organisations then have to work within, there is a huge interlinking of the challenges that besiege the sector. And another comment around the proposed welfare cuts will further exacerbate this issue. And we know that women bear the brunt of the sharpest ends of poverty, inequality, racism, misogyny. And that, again, is a really important intersectional challenge that is impacting the sector. Francesca says that it's a fine line between public protection and sensibility, but the power of recall in the hands of probation is proving to be a trigger finger, a reactive process as opposed to a more judicial process like it used to be. And we look at the recall rates, we look at the reasons why women are being recalled, and the increasing rate of recall is a huge concern, and is really certainly not going to help us address the prison crisis and supporting more women through community-based alternatives. Okay, just checking if there's any other. So in terms of moving forward, next steps. Let's blue sky thinking. What can we think about is a positive next step? Naomi, where do you think we should go now? What's the solution?
Oh, well, I think in terms of the work that we're doing collectively, you know, it's the start of some much needed conversations. There's a lot happening actually across the sector, in terms of, really thinking about women's justice, and where it might lead us. The report's tried really hard to be solutions focused. And we do need a sort of hard push on getting the government to, you know, to take up some of these if we believe, again, collectively that they are the right things to do. But I think we also need to sort of do a deeper dive into some of these areas. You know, we've skimmed over vast swathes of policy and theory, and there's lots that we need to explore. You know, from my perspective, what Helen's been talking about in terms of making the business case for investing to save, not just in strands of work within this project, but in the project itself, the overall project itself. And I think we need to sort of grasp the opportunity that the crisis in the prison system is presenting us, because, you know, there are savings to be made here. We should be aiming to close the majority of women's prisons and reinvesting that saving into women. So what I would really love to see is the economic model that allows us to do that and gives the government permission to release this investment, which is what's needed. But I think that you could start realising that investment pretty soon. Helen, did you have any other thoughts on that?
I'll tell you what you were making me think about, which was Holloway, and the closure of Holloway.
Yeah.
Something I think my fellow panelists can speak to more than I can, but I certainly spent a bit of time this morning just having a look into Holloway and thinking, hey, a women's prison closed. But vitally, what didn't happen next was that next stage of reinvesting the resource that was somehow held within that prison, finding it, getting it, and it moving with the women and with the women's justice issue. What happened was, well, we know the sale of the site was for various reasons quite slow, and all that money was sucked into the prison capacity building programme. It didn't go with the women, and I think what we end up with, and I don't mean this as a slight. I was having a look on the Peabody who bought the site this morning. They will have a women's centre, but the plan around that was suitably ambiguous, let's say. So yeah, that would be a fear of mine, could there be something about this strategy, and it is a fear that I hope is not realised, but is about, for the department, getting hold of some of those women's prison, re-rolling them as men's open prison, and we don't see the investment needed in a women's justice approach.
Thank you, Helen. And Liz, can we come to you? Bringing you in here, what do you think is what do we need to do now to progress?
Well, I think going along with what Naomi was saying in terms of deep dives, it's my favourite word at the moment. I do think, as well as finance, we need, and those on the Women's Justice Board need to be really engaged at looking at how do we ensure the involvement of women with lived experience. Jean Colston did it 20 years ago with assistance from the right people, but that has wobbled throughout the years, and there's been a hard fight to get those women's voices heard. And we all know, all of those who worked in criminal justice, it's those women not only hold the knowledge, they hold the key as well. And they need to be almost structurally involved. It sounds like I'm saying pack them up and pop them somewhere, but they need to figure, when the strategies come out and the structures for the future, they need to be in there. So that thinking needs to start now at the top. And with the public health approach as well, we say this in the report, we know we've done a very top level overview, but this is quite exciting work. And for some of those, particularly in probation and those working regionally, we've got some good metro mayors, we've got combined authorities coming in. The public health approach, if you get the right people round the table now, working out what it would need to look like, how it would be funded locally, you know, that could be a really exciting thing for people to be doing, thinking through now. And it doesn't need to cost the earth. And again, going to those areas where already whole systems approaches are working well and looking at how that could be extended, just modelling that right now, I think that would be vital. And the only other thing I'd say is Naomi and I are very open, and I know Abbi will be as well, to having conversations with people who've attended today, because that's what's so helpful at keeping issues alive, and we don't think of everything. And we're looking at doing some potential further work, looking at thought leadership from the women's sector. And again, deep dives needed to look at those complex issues, crucial to the design of a justice system that works for women. So issues like Harriet has already raised, the whole issue of women they've survived the domestic and sexual abuse, but they end up being charged when that's an inherent part of what's happened to them. How do we actually stop that happening? And there's expertise out there far beyond us. So we think it would be really exciting, whether it's webinars, whether it's papers, of actually bringing together some people and keeping those conversations going. So we're trying to create a movement now where this isn't going to go away. We're not going to fail again. We're going to help those people working on this and actually trying to get some sort of movement going, rather than the continual lobbying, which is important, but can be very tiring. And we think the energy will lie in this and help us take forward what we're saying in the report and beyond. But I think that's it. Thanks, Abbi.
No, thank you, Liz. I think that's a really important note to conclude on. I'd like to just bring in a couple of comments and questions from the chat to pose to you. Thinking about the role of PCCs, Grace asks, how can individual police and crime commissioner officers help to advance these conversations locally? What would we like to see in terms of that joined up working, that collaboration? Then I want to take that question.
Can I do that very briefly? I think PCCs have a crucial role, and certainly getting those conversations, if you've got women's centres in your area, engage with them in a meaningful way. Look at the work they can do and help you in your work with the police to stop things getting out of control. A minor thing, when we looked at this before, Vera Baird brought in conditional cautioning as a way of trying to make police the first and last point of contact. I remember thinking that's a great idea. Went to women's centres, is it necessary? Calderdale Women's Centre, police sergeant there said, no, don't want any conditional cautioning. When a woman comes in who's a bit disturbed, distressed, and we know she's not a major criminal, I just ring Claire at the Women's Centre to come and collect her. And I just thought, that's how it needs to be. But the police need the confidence to do that and to know the support is there. And I think there's a lot more that PCCs can be doing. I know they've got a lot on their plate, but actually stopping the unnecessary sucking in when we know that most of those women need support in the community, be it for mental health, be it for housing, the whole raft of issues they face.
Liz, thank you. Could you just scroll up just ever so slightly, just so I can read down a little bit, just so I can read Mark's comment about the positive next step for Black and migrant women. He makes the point that engagement with the Home Office on the intersection that women experience through their contact with the criminal justice system, immigration systems, immigration policy, the impact that this has on women and the women that are most affected by this. This is a really important point, and I know, Mark, I know you will be making this point very loudly, and recognising the disproportionality that exists within the criminal justice system and how this impacts women is really important for us to take forward. We're also joined by Katie Swain. We're really pleased to have you here today, Katie. We know you're a member of the Women's Justice Board, but speaking on your own behalf, you've commented that the report and this discussion has been very helpful, which is great. And I know that is very much the intention of the authors of this report, is to really help shape and progress strategic thinking. The political will is there, but there is a nervousness as shown in the row over the sentencing guidelines. The board is absolutely grappling with everything that's been mentioned today, ensuring strong engagement with women and the women's services sector. There is a lot of will across the sector to help with this, and absolutely I would advocate for that expression from the members of the National Women's Justice Coalition themselves are hugely committed to helping progress this strategy. So please do keep engaging with Women's Justice Board members to offer ideas, challenge and help. There is so much riding on this. It is a great opportunity, but clearly with some challenges ahead. And I think that sentiment is shared and echoed by my colleagues here today. Okay, thinking about time, there needs to be, again, just a comment there from Sarah, there needs to be more appreciation of the ramifications of charging non-violent women with violent crimes. Absolutely. Thinking about, you know, I was very startled recently at an event I had where women in prison were talking about the increased rate of prosecution against women who have, in their hour of absolute desperation and need, been charged with offences against first responders. So again, you know, it's very telling how the impact of violence against women is impacting the criminalisation of women so directly. Okay, just looking at the chat, any final questions? Do we think that the experiences of girls in contact with the youth justice system, the experiences of girls in contact with the youth justice system, are there parallels when they exit that system between adults and children? So does anyone feel that there are the experiences of girls in contact with youth justice, how do they translate and transfer into the criminal justice system? Are there issues there we need to be mindful of? Liz?
Well, absolutely huge issues. And what I was saying, I should have said it at the start under the lessons learned. If you want to stem the flow of women into the criminal justice system, you have to do much, much more with girls and young women, because it's there that things are going wrong in the community, and there's just not a lot around, again, apart from voluntary sector doing ACE work in pockets. So, and they can easily fall through the cracks where it's, oh, you're girls, not adult women. We only have to do that if we're being prison-centric. If we're not being prison-centric and we're looking at what are the drivers who will end up with young women coming into custody, children, great if they don't put them into mixed, youth offending places, I don't know, but that shouldn't be left to thinking for outside voluntary agencies. It should be part of the strategy as well.
And just adding to that, I mean, I think that there's obviously a huge issue with the care system and a huge overlap and intersection between what happens in the care system and the criminal justice system, particularly for girls, but not just for girls. Again, this is a huge issue for mothers as well. So that looking at that intersection is going to be key.
Yeah. Really interesting question around public awareness and reducing the stigmatisation of women. What can we do to increase and build support for this initiative to dismantle women's prisons and invest in alternatives to custody? How can we address public perception and reverse that punitive justice policy that has been drummed into our public consciousness?
I mean, I think, again, setting out the evidence much more clearly. I know that we've all set out the evidence and there is a lot of evidence in this space, but what I'm talking about is the theory of change, the business case, setting out how we're going to make those savings, improve people's lives. What, you know, how does that ecosystem work? I think that could be really compelling.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and then the final, positive comment coming through on the chat, it is really lovely that not only have so many of you dedicated your time to joining us today, but we have representatives from the Sentencing Review Panel and the Women's Justice Board joining in these conversations, which I think is very positive. It's illustrative of the collective commitment to improving justice for women. And I think today's been a really informative and inspiring session, convening such a large group of solution-based thinkers, who share this commitment and this will and inspiration to drive and improve outcomes for women in contact with or who are at risk of being drawn into the criminal justice system is key. It is, as Liz says, movement building. So really special thanks to Liz and Naomi for sharing their wisdom and expertise through this much needed report that I feel comes at a really opportune moment, a critical moment in time when the government seems to be really poised and ready to listen. And for elaborating today during the session on their insights and ideas. Thank you hugely to Helen, who's been leading our discussions and really helped to identify and address some of the critical next steps we need to take to really realise the ambition of this report. And a special thanks to our off-camera production team, who you all can't see, but Richard and Daisy have been policing the chat and feeding us cues throughout this session. So thank you hugely for being the backbone of this event, helping to expertly promote, produce and coordinate it to bring us all together so successfully. So moving forward, we really encourage you to share the Breaking Out of the Justice Loop report widely across your networks with your colleagues, with your teams, and share the recording of today's event as well, and do rewatch it too. We want to keep these conversations going. We want to spread the recommendations and examples of good practice that have been outlined in this report and discussed today. And we want to maintain this collective optimism that the transformative change we need to see is truly possible and is demonstrated through this report. So thank you to everyone. We'll be in touch with further updates on how we progress this planned work. Enjoy the rest of your day.